Okay, hi everyone. I think we are going to get started with our online session for NDF. No Mai, welcome. This online session is little effort, big audience insight with our fantastic presenter, Dr. Indigo Holcombe-James. I'm Lucy Patterson and I'm on the NDF board and I'm presenting today on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations over here in Naarm, Melbourne. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I am the Head of Experience, Digital and Insights at ACMI, Australia's National Museum of Screen Culture. So that's my day job, as well as being a volunteer on the NDF board. Before we hand over to Indigo, I've got a few housekeeping notes. So that we keep the session running smoothly, we ask that you keep yourself muted and have your cameras off so that we can focus on wonderful Indigo. The session will be recorded and will be available only for a few weeks afterwards. So if you want to have another chance to review or share it, we'll pop the link of the recording and any links and resources mentioned into an email to you in the next few days. Your questions and comments are most welcome. We really want to make this participatory and relevant for you. So please use the chat feature to ask any questions, and we'll have 10 or 15 minutes after Indigo's presentation to talk through those things. So yes, without further ado, we're really excited to welcome Indigo Holcombe-James to this NDF online session. Indigo is ACMI's strategic research lead, so works here with me, and she coordinates research projects, commissions, market research, and conducts the in-house visitor research that ensures audiences are at the centre of our museum. Prior to joining ACMI, Indigo was a research fellow at the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society at RMIT University, where she worked on questions of digital transformation and inequality in cultural and creative industries. And I'm sure Indigo will share a little bit more about what that work was when she introduces herself too. But now I will hand over to Indigo to get started. Thanks,
Thanks so
Indigo.
much, Lucy. I'm just going to share my slides. Can you see those okay? Are they
Yes,
showing? Great, excellent. Thank you so much. And thanks so much to NDF for inviting me to be part of this initiative. I've heard really great things about the series so far, so it's very exciting to be part of it. I'd like to begin our time together by acknowledging that I'm joining this meeting from sovereign land. I'm based in Naarm, Melbourne, and this place always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend those same respects to the First Nations peoples of the lands that you are all joining from today as well. Now, I've structured this lunchtime session into 6 parts, and I'm going to set myself a timer because I can carry on. We're going to do about 30 minutes of chat and then wrap and move to some questions, which I'm looking forward to. But the first 2 sections that I'm going to run through are really about situating myself and putting the rest of what I'm going to talk about for the remainder of the chat in context. I think it's really important that you know who you're speaking to with and what kind of background my expertise and my thoughts are coming from. In sections 3, 4, and 5, I'm going to talk through some when, hows, and what's about audience research, and I'm going to end with a couple of tips and leave some room to chat before we wrap up. Okay, so who am I? How did I get here? And why am I delivering this presentation? Like many of you, probably, I grew up visiting museums and galleries, but I never really thought of myself as a creative or participating within the space. My mum is an artist and an arts teacher. One of my sisters is an architect, and my brother is a practicing artist, whereas I really loved reading and writing, and I didn't really see myself in the same field. But I moved to Melbourne in my early 20s. And the first job that I landed was managing a dance studio on Smith Street in Collingwood. And so I was immediately sort of back and surrounded by artists and creative practitioners. Through this job, I made connections with dancers who worked for a company that ran arts workshops in remote First Nations communities. And again, sort of reflecting that interest in reading and writing, I eventually landed a contract gig with them where I wrote grants, conducted research, coordinated tours, things like that. And a big part of that job was sitting in the converted warehouse where their offices were in Brunswick making calls to remote First Nations communities around the country. But the calls I needed to make very rarely actually were answered, and often wouldn't go through at all. And the advice I usually got was instead to call the community payphone and hope that someone was walking past as it was ringing, who would pick up and be able to yell out, or who would know whoever it was that I was chasing. I didn't know this at the time, but through this process, I was traversing the digital divide, the gaps in digital access, use, and outcomes that derive from digital inequalities. I was, and unfortunately remain, a kind of bolshy person who's not always fully aware of convention or process. And so I was really struck by this, and I did some Googling, and I found the phone number for a researcher who worked on this topic, Professor Ellie Rennie, who was then at Swinburne and is now at RMIT. And I just really casually called her up and asked her to grab a coffee and to explain this thing to me. I was really lucky that Ellie was so generous to pick up the phone, to have the conversation, to then have the coffee. But also to kind of support this interest. And this curiosity eventually led to me returning to university, where I worked on my honours thesis and then my PhD with Ellie. And it was in my PhD in particular that my research returned to looking at the cultural sector. I was really interested in what it means to be a cultural organisation and to grapple with this digital inequality, and particularly what it means to deal with this inequality in a policy context, which increasingly positions digital technologies as a key function of service delivery. In Australia, for instance, our cultural policy typically positions digital technologies as a tool that will help cultural organisations to mitigate distance, so opening up, participation for whoever you are, wherever you are, and unlocking or opening up collections. Again, that kind of access piece. But it struck me, and it remains, I think, a really important thing to consider, is how can that be the case when we know that enormous swathes of the population remain disproportionately disconnected? So that is what the area of my thesis research really played with. I finished that project in late 2019, and then you may remember early 2020 was a weird time. COVID hit and we all shut our doors. And I was really curious about what this meant. When I was designing my PhD and getting research participants together and research partners together with cultural organisations, it was striking just how many cultural organisations would respond to me and effectively say that they didn't understand the point of the work. They were already doing digital. They knew how this worked. It was fine. Yeah, we don't need this kind of thinking. So in the wake of COVID, I launched a small pilot project to understand how my thesis findings were playing out now, if everyone was now online and that was the primary means of engagement. Were we grappling with more barriers, new barriers? What did it look like? This project quite quickly snowballed into a much larger research project than I had originally anticipated. And over 2 years, I ended up working with around 100 cultural organisations across Australia. This work forms the basis of my seemingly never-ending book project that is in theory due in April next year. But while I was doing that work, I also became a research fellow based at RMIT in the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making in Society, where I worked on a whole bunch of different digital inequalities research. And I started collaborating with Seb and Lucy at ACMI on the CEO Digital Mentoring Program that NDF have brought out to New Zealand as the Executive Digital Mentoring Program. And I kind of slowly segued into ACMI full-time, where I now work as Strategic Research Lead. So that is an extremely long-winded way of kind of situating myself, but also to say that across all of these projects and in each of these roles, I've worked with a range of qualitative and quantitative research methods, often in relationship with cultural organisations, audiences, and creative practitioners, to do things like uncovering, understanding, and informing dynamics of practice. So this kind of research thread thinks about what is happening right now and why is it happening like that, and to document and demonstrate delivery of impact. So what has happened and to what consequence? This is what I do at ACMI, and my role is very grandly titled Strategic Research Lead. But in practice, I think about my job as kind of having 3 buckets, as well as some vague bits and bobs that float in and out of it. But the first bucket is research that we conduct with our university partners. For example, we're the primary industry partner on an ARC linkage project based at RMIT that is exploring museum digital social futures. And my role there is to coordinate our involvement in that, to write articles with the researchers, to recruit members for participation, et cetera, et cetera. The second bucket is research that we commission from market providers, for example, Morris Hargreaves McIntyre or Pattern Makers or EY Sweeney. And the third bucket is research that we design and conduct in-house. And for our time together, I'm really going to be focusing on these two buckets today. So what is audience research for at ACMI? For us, it is important because it places audiences at the heart of our decision-making. It also ensures that our impact is legible and that we are able to communicate this impact to our stakeholders and our communities. It is increasingly insufficient for us to just have a vibe about the work that we do, to have a conviction that is important. We need to be able to demonstrate that it is important and that it is doing good in the world. It's also really important, I think, to note that research at ACMI is not about critiquing individuals, teams, or outcomes. We're really careful about ensuring that research is always about foregrounding audiences, about identifying and showing that impact, and in very real ways is about opening opportunities for continuous development. This is really important because nothing is ever done, nothing is ever perfect, and bringing audience experience into our understanding of success is critical for ensuring that we live in this practice every day. So as Lucy mentioned already, ACMI's audience research function sits within the Experience, Digital and Insights team, also known as Lucy's team. And we're located within the Experience and Engagement division of the museum, where you can also find functions like brand and marketing or visitor experience teams. ACMI is a little bit unusual in that insights aren't located in brand and marketing like it is in many museums. And this is quite a strategic decision. And it means that we have a bit more flexibility in terms of where and how we work. Now, I know this conversation is about opportunities to deliver audience research on a shoestring or on a budget or with minimal effort. And I want to really contextualize the resources that we're working with to frame up what we're talking about today. So within Lucy's team delivering this work, we have myself at full-time, and we have a wonderful UX researcher, Tim Woodward, who works with us on a casual basis at around 3 days a week. And we collaborate really closely with ACMI's head of data and CRM, Marty Gray, and our audience engagement analyst, Ben Haller, who are both located in brand and marketing. So research is often a cross-team effort. But if we were to divide up, I suppose, the responsibilities of these different people, Tim and myself really work directly with visitors, often with qualitative data, so text-based data, feedback, conversations, whereas Ben and Marty are often in charge of things like ticketing data, building counters, Google Analytics, things like that, often quantitative, often data that is collected kind of as a default setting within the museum. But we don't just collaborate with our colleagues in brand and marketing. Doing this work really means working across, up, down, around, throughout the museum. And the way that we do this work together is governed by our research and evaluation sub-strategy. This document sits underneath our audience strategy, and last year was the inaugural year of the strategy, and the development of it and the delivery of it was driven by these 3 pillars on the left of develop, deliver, embed. We're in the process of reflecting on works completed to date, and we're refreshing the strategy for the new financial year. And we're looking at a slightly revised framing of refine, distribute, and embed. And under this strategy, we deliver a range of research outcomes. And I'll just take you through them really briefly. So at ACMI, we run a series of longitudinal visitor research studies. One of them is around our museum audience. And this is something that we used to commission and conduct externally. So we would pay for a company to come on site and to basically survey visitors as they left as part of an intercept study. We've recently brought this in-house, and basically once a week, one of our VX guides who's been trained up in survey methods does these intercept studies on our behalf. For public programs and our cinemas, we deliver a longitudinal visitor study via post-visit EDM. And we can do this because both of these offers are ticketed, and a large proportion of attendees either book online using their email address, or they book using an account that has an email address associated with it. So the day after their visit, they'll get an email from us that has an invitation to provide their feedback and a link to the survey. And we report on this collectively to understand our entire museum audience at the end of each financial year. We deliver a series of research around formative or front-end practices. So that might be testing exhibition ideas or identifying market size for a particular product. We deliver rapid visitor research. So in the first 3 weeks of a major exhibition, we run a kind of concentrated and intense burst of audience research where we work with our visitor experience guides and our audiences themselves to understand how the exhibition is landing, what things might be able to be improved. And we work then with our exhibitions team to either rectify things, so little tweaks that might be able to be made, or to document and to build those learnings into practice for the next exhibition. We do a range of visitor outcomes and impacts reporting. And this is really designed to demonstrate the impact of our work, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. We deliver summative evaluations, which is really reporting on outcomes based on the KPIs that are set either by the organisation as a whole or for a particular project. We do prototyping or UX style research where we're testing early examples of an idea to feed into practice. A useful example of this is work that Tim Woodward has delivered around feeding into the development of an exhibition that we have currently coming up about a video game that you might have heard of. It's called Untitled Goose Game. And so Tim did some work around testing the best ways to explain video games controllers within the museum. And he made some paper prototypes and worked on the floor with about 5 to 10 visitors to get their feedback and to feed into the exhibition design. We do desk-based research. So, for example, last year we did a bunch of work around price sensitivity in the market, drawing on secondary sources to understand and to feed into ticket pricing initiatives. And we do a whole bunch of research with university partners, which is super interesting, but totally out of scope here. So that's kind of what we do. In terms of who interacts with audience research, as I mentioned before, it is really a whole cross-museum endeavour. For an average research project, these are the folks or departments that we engage with at each stage. So we found that this level of engagement across the museum really means that we get buy-in and can generate changes from the work that we're delivering. In the research design phase, for example, we work really hard to bring programmers like curatorial or public programming teams into the design process so that they're onboarded and can inform the research in terms of what is interesting or useful for them. For example, it might be that they have used a slightly different or a new interpretation technique that they'd like to understand how it's landing with audiences and what kind of questions or needs come out of that. In the data collection phase, we rely really heavily on our visitor experience guides to feed in visitor observations. These people are the closest to our visitors on a daily basis, and bringing their insights in can be really, really beneficial. I've got sometimes next to programmers there. We're working more on bringing programming teams like curatorial, exhibition designers into this visitor observation process to kind of short circuit the findings piece. I really strongly believe that being on the floor is a really beneficial and free thing that we should all be doing far more often. And I'm speaking to myself there a little bit too. Once the reporting process is finished, we present back to the folks brought together for phase 1. The work gets shared with leadership and the findings are hopefully taken into practice or into decision making. So that is how we do the work at ACMI, and that is who I am and where we are situated. But I want to use the final portion of our time together to talk through some when, how, and what questions that I hope will be useful for you to take away. And my first question is a when question. When should we bring in audience research? I actually think that this question opens up a whole bunch of sub-questions, which is a classic researcher thing to do. But first of all, I think it's really important for us to know if we're feeding into a decision that can and will be actively informed by audience research, or, as is the case that is perhaps more frequent than is ideal, has the decision actually already been made and the audience research will therefore only have a very limited capacity to have impact. In this kind of instance, research can become a box-ticking exercise, and I think it's really best to avoid if possible, and we can talk about that a little bit more later. I think it's also important to ask if it is a decision that audience research can actually inform. An example of this might include the decisions that need to be made around which image of a particular exhibition item are going to be used in a marketing campaign. Audience research could be really useful here. We could talk through in focus groups or even just run downstairs and show people some options and figure out which resonates the most with particular subsets of audiences, and that would be really useful. But if the license holders are never going to provide the rights to use the images in this way, that's not a decision that audience research can actually inform. So the next question I think that we need to answer is about the intention of the research. What is the research actually intended to do? Is it to inform a decision, or is it to evidence an impact, or is it something else entirely, a secret third thing? I think knowing answers to this question is really important because it should change when you do the work, how you do the work, and who the audience for this work is. If you need to deliver research that will inform decisions, you want to do the work before the decision is made. Kind of comes back to my first point, the decision might already be made. The research is likely going to be testing out a series of ideas or a series of assumptions. And the audience for the work is, in my case, usually an internal kind of conversation. It might be within an exhibition team, or it might be with a leadership team. If you need to deliver research that evidences an impact, you want to do the work while the exhibition or the project is running. You want to have a really clear idea of the intended impact and the theory of change that underpins it. And in my case, the audience for this kind of work is usually going to be external. It might be to a funder or a policymaker or to senior leadership within the organisation. These divisions, of course, are blurry, and evidence of impact can inform decisions and vice versa. But the point really is that you need to know what the intent of the work you're doing is from the start. The next piece is around, will the decision actively impact visitor experience? An example of this might be prototyping and interactive, and knowing that your findings are going to inform the development of a visitor experience kind of shapes how you make recommendations. So they need to be oriented towards actions that can improve that immediate thing rather than observations or a kind of critical analysis, perhaps. And finally, what do you need in place to do the research? And once it's done, does it require ongoing maintenance or review? What are the kind of reporting infrastructures that sit around it? So in the ACMI context here, I'm thinking about metrics that might be considered sort of business as usual things. Visitor counts, for example. This is a metric that we have to report on, and that requires setting up and maintenance of people counters at various thresholds, but it effectively runs forever and has got established analysis and reporting requirements. More unusual requests might require bespoke or tweaked research infrastructure to be developed and deployed, and therefore also requires reporting overheads and analysis time to be factored in. So again, knowing when and how the work you're undertaking is going to be delivered and reported on is really important for figuring out when the work can come into the delivery process. So the key things I think to know about when is around what intent the work is supposed to have. Does it need to happen before a decision? Does it need to happen during or after an exhibition or an outcome? Do you have the lead time to complete this work as is necessary? If you're delivering audience research for a decision that needs to be made next week, your methods and your approach need to shift to account for that. And do you have what you need in place to do this work, or do you need to account for infrastructural setup or lead times? Okay, so that's some of the when piece. I want to talk a little bit now about how we might bring audience research in. And this is really my favorite part because it's about data. And what kind of data have you got access to, and what might you need to collect? So the first thing I suggest doing is a bit of a data audit. So what methods and sources do you currently have access to, and how can you or might you be able to leverage these sources for various projects? So an example might be if your exhibitions are ticketed, you are likely already collecting things like postcodes at the point of purchase. This can be leveraged to map your audiences out. There might also be an opportunity to add further questions to the purchase pathway. This could be done online or offline. At ACMI, we occasionally work with our ticketing staff to collect little snippets of data of things that we are particularly interested in. Recently, we collected data at the purchase pathway on whether the visitor's attendance was motivated specifically by the paid exhibition or whether they were converted into being paid exhibition visitors while they were on site. If you've got social media platforms, website analytics, Google reviews, these are all sources of valuable information about visitor perceptions of your organisation, the word of mouth that is spreading about your organisation, and digital engagements that could be delved into. You could do this via quantitative methods, so working with the analytics that are built into the system, which can be super interesting. Or you could do that through qualitative methods. So for example, a digital ethnography about how your organisation is spoken about on Instagram can be really useful for thinking about what are the areas of the museum or the organisation that your visitors think are worthy of sharing with their friends and family. And the findings from that might feed valuably into marketing plans or opportunities to expand that type of service delivery on site. Visitor observation, as I've already mentioned, is so important, and it's cheap beyond the time that it requires to do. Spending time in our galleries, in our museums, observing visitors as they engage with our products is an incredibly valuable activity. And again, we should all do it more often. And again, I am talking to myself. I think the other piece around visitor observation is that it is not just hanging out in the space. There are ways to structure visitor observations and to turn it into data that is easily usable and is easily replicable across your teams. And I'll talk a little bit more about checklists and frameworks that can be used to do this later on. Then once you've done your data audit and you receive a request for visitor research, it's a good idea to ask if you need to collect new data at all. Often we have existing surplus data that if we analyze it in a different way or combine it in various forms, we might not need to collect new data at all. It may be that the questions you have can be answered with the data you already have. If you do decide to collect new data, you need to decide what kind. Quantitative data is really good for questions like how many and what kind. Qualitative data is good for answering why questions and what questions. You will, however, usually need both. And I'm going to talk about what it means to kind of design up a project now. And I talked before about there being two broad buckets of intention for audience research. So the first being to inform a decision and the second to evidence and impact. And I'm going to talk through what developing up a research project for each of them looks like in my world. So if I was going to do audience research to inform a decision, for example, the decision might be which exhibition will we put on next? I would first start by brainstorming how audience data could factor into this decision. For example, we might need to know how many visitors we might expect. We might want to know what kind of visitors would be interested in the exhibition concept. We might want to know what kind of expectations those visitors have of the exhibition. We would want to know what would most motivate their attendance, and we'd want to know how much they would be willing to pay. I would then be thinking about how I could collect this data. And because I have got a mix of qualitative and quantitative data needs, I would probably do a mixed methods survey. You can find survey providers online. There are a whole range of free ones. There are relatively cheap subscriptions that can be valuable for accessing to gain particular functionalities. At ACMI, we use SurveyMonkey. We have a paid subscription, not a paid prescription, that allows us to do some fancy things with survey logic that you can't do on the free one, but the free one is actually pretty good too. So now I've designed my survey and I've set it up on my survey provider. I need to think through how I'm going to collect the data and who I'm going to collect it from. My on-site visitors are a no or a low cost option. I could run downstairs and chat to a group of folks right now. For a decision about exhibitions we might put on, you probably want a large survey sample. But if you're thinking about developing an interactive or choosing between two images, you might just want to go down and get a small sample of responses, maybe 10 people to talk to and see how they react. But visitors are not quite right for this research project, this test of which exhibition we'll put on next, because they're already ACMI people. They already know who we are. They've already been convinced to enter the building. So they're not quite right. I could go out to our members. Again, another great avenue for research. Really no to low cost involved there. They'd be great if we were looking for insights into how we might improve the ACMI membership offer. But again, not quite right for this particular questions, because if we're thinking about which exhibition we want to put on next, we want to go to a broad survey sample and not necessarily people who are already convinced that ACMI is an excellent place to visit. So with all of that in mind, your next option is strangers. And this is the hardest and probably the most costly avenue for this project. But I would really strongly suggest investing the dollars here if you can, because for this project, I would need to know how the concept plays out in the general domain. So we want to make sure we're reaching beyond ACMI walls. There are a bunch of options for reaching strangers. You could do a snowball sample and go out through your members and ask them to pass on a survey to their friends and family who've never been to ACMI. If you've got lots of time, that could be a good way to do it. Again, really cheap, low cost. But usually I find these decisions need to be made faster than that. And so You could commission a market provider to do this work. You might go to someone like MHM, or in Australia, like Pattern Makers is another example. And they would take on all the research design and sample responsibilities in the reporting, which is excellent. It takes it out of the internal team, but it can also be expensive. An alternative model that we often do is to do the survey design and reporting in-house, but to commission the data collection via an online panel provider. This can save money and time, but it costs in internal resourcing requirements. So it's always a bit of a balancing act, and really happy to talk through opportunities there as well. You then also need to figure out how many survey responses you want to get back. And I think this question is a really tricky one. One thing that is often raised is, are we aiming for statistical significance? And in most instances, I would argue no. We're not really holding ourselves to a standard of medical research or, properly scientific research. We want to get enough data to make a decision, and we want to and determining what that looks like is in part a methods question, but it's also a question of what your colleagues and your organisation will trust. In terms of the organisational trust piece, one way to get at that is by looking at past research that your organisation may have done and reviewing what sample sizes are understood as being comfy for making decisions with. But you also want to think about how you want to cut the data. If you want to look at the behaviours and experiences of subgroups within the data, you need to make sure you collect enough responses within each category to have robustness. So, for example, you could look at the total sample, or you might want to look at how particularly women between 18 to 24 respond to a survey. So you need to have enough representation within the data to do that kind of work. The final thing on this slide is extension opportunities, and that's really emphasising the role that publicly available data sets can bring to this work. We use the ABS cultural participation data almost every day to situate our smaller studies within broader documentation of cultural participation patterns. So that's a quick guide to audience research to inform a decision. If we were thinking about research to evidence and impact, you need to know what the impact is you want to demonstrate and have a clear understanding of the theory of change that underlies it. So as part of our exhibition development process, we identify a series of visitor outcomes that we will deliver through the work. And in doing that, we articulate why we're going to deliver these outcomes in relation to our organisational strategy, as well as in relationship to key policy domains. For our previous paid exhibition, Marshmallow Laser Feast Works of Nature, a key visitor outcome was for visitors to leave with an increased understanding of who Marshmallow Laser Feast are and how they use technology in their creative process. This was important for our organisational strategy because we're a museum of screen culture, and contributing to public growth in awareness of technology is an important part of our vision. And it was also important for showing the impact of our work in relationship to cultural policy. So we can see a key aim of cultural policy is to enable knowledge, ideas, and insights to be gained through intellectual stimulation, critical reflection, creative thinking, or deeper understanding. So demonstrating that we're able to deliver on that is a key sort of way to show policymakers that we are doing the work that they want us to be doing. In terms of the purple flow chart on the side here, this is kind of the process that we use to map out this work. The first kind of parts of the sentence stay, they're in bold. So we always have a sentence that starts with visitors will, and that's the outcome. We then have a sentence that's to achieve this outcome, what we will do within the gallery or within the exhibition. We will do this because, and that's where we map out our impact or the reason that we will do this in relationship to our strategy, as well as cultural policy narratives, and then what we will need to do to know that we were successful and how we will measure that. In the context of Marshmallow Laser Feast, I've just pulled out a couple of slides from our reporting on this originally, and we were able to demonstrate that before visiting the exhibition, 18% of all visitors were familiar with MLF. So under 20% knew who they were before they came. And after visiting the exhibition, 85% of all visitors agreed that they had an increased understanding of who MLF are. 68% agreed that they intend to explore or learn more about the artist collective post-visit. 80% of all visitors agreed that their understanding of how technology can be used in creative processes has been increased as a result of the exhibition. And more than half of all visitors told us that they were inspired to explore or engage with technology as part of their own creative processes because of attending the exhibition. And I've got some visitor quotes on the side that help to illustrate these quantitative findings. For us, this was really important and really valuable research findings because we were able to demonstrate that we were actively delivering on our programming and audience sub-strategies here. And I know that I'm running slightly over and into question time, so I'm going to keep moving on. But you can see on the slide here what we're trying to be able to evidence and to talk about in terms of leadership conversations, but also with policymakers and funders. So to do this kind of evidencing of impact, the process is really similar to research that informs a decision. We've got a slightly different series of questions that we need to address. We need to know what the impact is and the theory of change that underpins it. We need to think through how audience data might demonstrate that impact. And I've got some suggestions there around what we might be looking for. You need to think through how you might collect the data. And this is often much more cost effective, much easier to do than looking for external people. You've got an active cohort of visitors on site within the gallery. You can access them really easily. For our work on this, we actually capture the majority of our responses, and for each exhibition, we end up with roughly 2,000-ish responses. And we get the majority of that through a QR code that's at the exit of the gallery. Okay. So you've done all your data, your research design and your data collection, but what do you do with it all? And I would argue that this is the really tricky part, and it is possibly the most difficult time to make visible. And it can be really, really hard. It always takes more time than you anticipate. And so building out our research design, I really strongly recommend almost doubling your analysis time that you need to do the next bits. Ways we've found to manage this tension at ACMI include exploring opportunities to provide teams with direct access to the data. So, for example, our public programs and cinemas longitudinal research is provided live to the team so that they can see the insights coming through already. You don't want to collect more data than you need. While analysing a 300-row spreadsheet of quant data takes roughly the same time as doing a 30-row spreadsheet, the same is not true for qualitative data. So managing sample sizes in relationship to need and use and time available is really critically. And the other key thing is working to build in trust in the research process and bringing delivery teams into the process itself. So bringing the teams along with us as well. Okay, finally, super quickly, so there's some time for chat. My top tips for audience research are to know as much as you can about what the research needs to do before you start, to conduct a data audit to identify what you already have, what tweaks might be useful to make it as useful as possible, and that way you then know when you'll need to collect new data and what kind of overhead you might have. Collecting new data can be costly, but can be almost free. If the aim of your audience research is to better understand visitor behaviour, getting into the gallery and observing them directly should be your first step. And we should turn visitor observations into data by putting rigour around it and documenting our findings. I really strongly recommend looking up tracking and timing studies to understand wayfinding pathways. You can draw a little map on your document, on your piece of paper, and go down and start actually drawing out where visitors are going and what they're doing and how long they're spending in those spaces. I also really recommend doing other people's surveys. I have become that person who says yes to every single survey request. I make note of good questions, and I have a dictionary of questions that we can draw on whenever we're needing to design a new study. I also suggest subscribing to audience research organisations, and I've listed a bunch on the screen here who provide really valuable and free resources. Publicly available data sets can build out enormous value in your work. And finally, bringing the organisation along with you. There's nothing more depressing than doing all the work and then the report sitting in a filing room going dusty. Working collaboratively can be slower, but it's much more effective in the long run. So that is where I'll leave it and say hello to Lucy and any questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Indigo. That was a really thorough fly through of everything that I have witnessed you doing in the last 18 months at ACMI, and really exciting to see under the lid a bit more about, your methodologies and the practice. So thank you so much. We had a few questions come in before the session with registration, and one of the big focuses, obviously with it being a national digital forum, is around digital. So there were questions around website, evaluation and research, collections online. How do you show the value of that, interactive experiences, VR, XR, all of those things. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, and maybe because the example that we had here was an exhibition, but I wonder if you could just talk through, I guess, demystifying it a little bit around, how you would approach the digital side of things and how different that might be and whether it is at all.
Yeah, totally. Thanks, Lucy. I actually think it's not that different at all. And often the provision of existing analytics in the back end of digital products makes life a lot easier. Or I mentioned already things like social media analytics, Google Analytics, having access to all of that quant data at your fingertips can be a total boon, but can also be super intimidating. And I think there is real value in doing qualitative research around digital products as well. One thing that we are currently working up to doing at ACMI is thinking more about UX kind of testing of new products. So Lucy's team and others in the team have been working on a refresh of the what's on pages of our work. And as part of that, we commissioned a design agency to do some user testing on a couple of prototypes. So that was working with like 5 folks and setting them a couple of key tasks. So the website page was intended to provide what's on information. And so we set the team a couple of questions like, can you find out what's on this day? Can you find X event? And can you do this? And then the researchers observed the visitors working through that. It's exactly the same as observing a visitor going through the physical space. So I think we can kind of apply the same methods to either side.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Indigo. We also had some questions around outdoor spaces, heritage sites, parks, and it feels like the same methodology again, observational surveys. You can use QR codes to give people access to things. Yeah, that seems also similar.
Yeah, totally. I know QR codes are a bit naff, but we've found them extremely successful in gathering visitor data, particularly post-COVID, where everyone's really used to scanning things, and it can be like a low-touch, low-cost way of collecting data at a sort of longer-term time frame.
My background is definitely in product, like digital product, UX design, that sort of area. And so it's always been my practice that, 8 people is enough when you're testing like you just said, a prototype or a website. If you get 8 opinions or 8 people and you don't get any new opinions from those 8, that is pretty much you've got enough evidence there to go and make an informed decision. And at ACMI, as you've been introducing the research and evaluation strategy, there's been lots of talk around what's a sample size, like how do we know how many people, and you said earlier about a 300-row, thing of data versus, people that you might have in a focus group. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about what those thresholds are so that people feel like if they get those questions internally, they kind of have some sort of, I guess, best practice to back it up.
Yeah, totally. I think, Lucy, when you're talking about prototyping and UX and 8 people being enough, what you're really talking about is saturation of data, right? Like when you're talking to your visitors or to your 8 testing people and you stop hearing new things, you've reached thematic saturation. So you could continue to talk to 100 people, but the likelihood is that you're still going to hear the same patterns and you're just getting more information. That's not necessarily a good thing. There's definitely a tipping point where you kind of move over the hump of what's valuable and what's not. But that's qualitative research. When we're dealing with quant data, you do want to get to a larger sample size because you're often trying to make leaps between your sample and the bigger kind of area. So for our longitudinal visitor research, we have visitation at ACMI of 900,000 a year, something like that. We look for about 2,000 responses, which feels like a lot, but that's actually 20 responses a week. That's not that many responses in the long run. But again, I think it's that building trust piece in the organization as well around that visitor expertise is really vital to these conversations. And it doesn't actually, the sample size is not the key question necessarily.
And I don't think we have time to get into that in terms of building the trust in the organisation, but we might do a follow-up. And definitely we have, you know, other forums to have these conversations. We might go a couple of minutes over. It's 11 o'clock, but if people are happy to stay, we might just answer the questions that are in the chat, which the two that have come through actually relate to one another. So Kate has asked about the closure of an exhibition and talking a little bit more about how you collect the longitudinal data. And then Kate again has asked, given a bit more context, that she's at the Department of Conservation and talking through encouraging behavioural change and when might be the best time to do that kind of surveying or questioning post-visit.
Yeah, nice one. I think that's such a great question. For our exhibition testing, like on similar impact pieces, we ask visitors as they leave. So they have the QR code plinth as they walk out of the gallery, and that's where they have the opportunity to scan and to ask that question. And then if they bought their ticket with us on an account that has an email address associated with them, 24 hours later, they get the post-visit EDM that has the same survey in it. So they've got two options there. We know that immediately after exiting the exhibition and 24 hours after exiting the exhibition, we're really collecting data on intention or, you know, very early impact. That for us, for most of our projects, is sufficient. I think what would be amazing and what we'd like to build into projects where it's appropriate is to do a follow-up survey with these folks, say 6 months later, and be like, are you still thinking about these things? Have you put any of the learnings into practice? And what does that look like? And in that instance, you'd have two samples. So you'd have your immediate people who left, and then you'd have likely a much smaller group of people of demonstrating that longer term impact of the work. Yeah, exactly. I think 6 months is a really nice window because it's like enough to get, it's not fresh anymore and it's potentially been embedded into practice.
Thank you so much. I don't think we've got any other questions coming through, so I think we will finish up there. And thank you so much again, Indigo, for spending your time with NDF and all our members and audience. We really appreciate it. An email will be coming soon with the recording, any links to things that we mentioned. And I think, yeah, just thank you to Indigo for all of the really descriptive stuff in the slide deck, because I think that will be a really wonderful resource for people to revisit. Our next online session is an introduction to writing prompts for AI, so prompt engineering. This will give our audiences a great base to start working and experimenting with generative AI in small and helpful ways. We're also currently offering on-demand workshops on Maori data sovereignty and digital preservation. And so you can head to our website, ndf.org.nz, to see some more information on that. You can also sign up to our newsletter. All of these links are in the chat for you. I think Holly has dropped them in there. And thank you again, Indigo, and also to all of our guests for joining us over your lunch break. Kia ora.